Thank you very much. Well, it's a great honor to be here. I was here a few months ago in January to an audience organized at the UN University, so it feels at home. I know this auditorium. I want to speak about one aspect of the work that I have done over the years. It's ongoing. Even at my age, I like to prove theorems. It sort of comes naturally to me, and I feel frustrated if I don't prove something to make my understanding of things better. I feel bad. So this is an ongoing work that I'm going to be reporting on today, but it has a structure now. I like to think it's a good structure, and what I want to do is to share with you something like the theoretical basis of the framework that I've tried to create. The questions will be familiar to you. I'll work through them with you. But the way you transform the questions into a manageable form does depend on some theoretical reasoning, and I want to work through that with you as well in the next 48 minutes. And then a few of my younger colleagues who thought these ideas were not that bad felt they would like to take it forward and try and put it to work on admittedly very crude data, so that we could perhaps make sense of the world around us as seen through the lens that this framework has created. And so I will wish to report some salient findings there. All the findings will be very tentative. It's ongoing, and I'm very proud to say that and I'm pleased to say that the current endeavor and the empirical side of the thing that I'll be talking about has now found a new home in Japan. So it's nice that I should be able to introduce you to these ideas here today. This paper, this lecture, is about the idea of sustainable development, and I want to argue, and I'll go through a few slides to show you that what we want to measure and track over time in assessing the sustainability of development paths is something that we all know intuitively, talk about it all the time, but for somehow or the other it has been missed from national accounts. And the idea is wealth. So I'll be talking about the wealth of nations. Adam Smith wrote a book on it, perhaps not quite the way I will be framing it today, which is just as well. That's nearly 250 years ago, so you would like to think even in economics there is progress. Okay. Right. There are many reasons why a nation needs economic accounts. The way these accounts should be fashioned depends on their purpose. In this lecture, I'm concerned with economic evaluation, and I'll look at accounts from that perspective. We evaluate economies so as to assess and prescribe. They are two seemingly different activities, and we do so because we are curious to know the answers to 6 questions about them. In this lecture, I'll be thinking of an economy as a nation, but nothing in this framework limits us to doing that. The economy could be a household, could be an individual, a bachelor living on his own or her own, could be a city of Tokyo, could be a village, could be a district, could be a nation. Of course, sometimes we even think of the world economy, so the economy as a whole. Here, I'm going to be concerned with nations for reasons you will see later when we put some numbers to things. So the 6 questions are the following. How is the economy doing? how has it been doing in recent years? Notice 1 and 2 are asked every day in the newspapers. The back pages give you, say, for example, the World Development Reports. At the back pages of the World Development Reports will have tables giving you the history, economic history of the country in terms of improvements or deteriorations in a wide variety of indicators. That's question 2. Question 1 is saying, well, what's the state of affairs now? Question 3, what should be our forecast of the economy if policies evolve over time in the way we expect them to evolve? I'm going to call that a forecast. And all evaluation is movements across forecasts. Question 4, how is the economy likely to perform under alternative policies? So you have a forecast, and then you ask yourself the question, suppose a tax is imposed on high income and so forth. How will that affect the economy? How will it move away from the forecast that I've made under business as usual? 5, which policies should we support? So you compare policies by judging the implications of the policy on the forecast, on the future trajectory of the economy. And of course, then we are inevitably asked the question, what would be an ideal set of policies? Okay? Now, when I say we, who is we? I want you to think here of we as being us, each of us as individuals, we as citizens. Occasionally, when we are so moved, we think like citizens. We do say, we recommend policies to ourselves or to our friends, if they're listening, that might even hurt us a little bit. We say, oh, the income tax that I pay is perhaps too low. More should be done for producing public goods. So we do occasionally take the bigger hat. And it's that kind of a hat that I'm concerned with here. Of course, the we could even be the government social evaluator, could be an international civil servant doing his or her job. So I want to leave the we rather vague because it doesn't really matter for my purpose. We're looking at somebody who is concerned with society, the economy, and allows his own interest to be part of it, but brings others' interest in as well. Questions 1 and 2 direct us to assess the performance of an economy. That's the assessment side. Whereas questions 4 to 6 are prompted by our need to evaluate policy. 3 is the benchmark around which 4 to 6 are studied. That's 3, that's the forecast. The former directs us to exercises in sustainability analysis, the latter to policy analysis. What do I mean by that? Let me be very brief because it's should be intuitively clear. So we have a forecast of the economy. We make a judgment. We all make forecasts. In policy analysis, you ask the question, or we ask the question, suppose a policy introduced now. It will perturb the economy. It will shift the trajectory of the economy as it moves through time. We have to have an understanding of the way the world works. Social, natural world interaction works. Policies made now, it redirects the economy, has long-run consequences, and somehow we want to bring the long-run consequences back to today and judge whether the move is a good thing or a bad thing. In sustainability analysis, in contrast, we are not doing policy. We are asking, suppose this is the policy and the evolution of the policy as I forecast. What will the world look like or the economy look like tomorrow as compared to today? Or if I'm doing retrospective analysis, I say, are we better off today than we were yesterday or 10 years ago? So the perturbation or the change that we're assessing or evaluating in sustainability analysis is the movement of time. We move through time and we see how things are as compared to the past. Movement through time is also a change. Policy is a change brought in at a moment in time, and sustainability analysis is the change that the movement of time itself brings to an economy. Okay? What are the customary indicators? What do we actually usually look at when we do either policy or sustainability analysis? Well, these are usual ones, our usual bag of tricks: gross domestic product relative to population. Sometimes we worry about inequality, in which case we ask for inequality measures or indices, poverty measures and indices. Then there are the Human Development Index, which is very popular now within the United Nations and other. Those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the HDI, the Human Development Index, is a linear combination of GDP, per capita, life expectancy at birth, and literacy. There have been further developments of it, but I do want to point out that these are ad hoc. They're ad hoc because the methods by which they were arrived at, when I said they, I mean take the Human Development Index, it was like saying, I like this, life expectancy is a good thing, literacy is a good thing, goods are a good thing, let's put them together. They were not moved by any further consideration. Inequality and poverty measures are, of course, targeted at a much narrower concept. You're looking at inequality, and obviously you want to have a measure of it, and so forth. Then there is a fourth type of data, which I don't know if students here are familiar with it, but it's quite popular now among psychologists, which is reported. Ask people, how do you feel? Are you happier today than you were last year? Are you more contented? And so forth. And the idea is a sort of an applied, a practical way of teasing out from people's answers about the state of their well-being. Whereas, say, in the Human Development Index, it has some elements of behavior that comes through GDP, for example, plus objective measures or semi-objective measures like life expectancy. That's health, literacy, that's education. So these are the ones we are familiar with, and we use them all the time. We think along those lines. But none of them addresses the question of the future. Here's the problem. We, in making decisions now, are judging how we are moving through time in sustainability analysis. We have to bring the future into account. That's the tricky part, and that's what makes this area so fascinating intellectually. Somehow the forecast allows you to bring the future, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, somehow bring them into today, because we care about them, or we think we care about them. We certainly, each of us as parents, care about our children, our grandchildren, our neighbors and their grandchildren, and so forth. But we have parallel concerns across people. Okay, so I'm going to work backwards. So far I've been looking at sort of the ends, well-being, utility or happiness or satisfaction, something like the state of mind which brings, enhances life's quality. I want to talk about now the productive capacity of an economy as a measure of the means towards the economy's ends. I'm going to call the ends intergenerational well-being. And the adjusted for population size, I'll be coming back to it later. The economic counts we seek are ones that would enable us to measure the productive capacity in terms of the ends. Now this looks, I'm skipping over quite a bit, but I shouldn't. I want to give you an intuitive sense of what I'm going to do. Suppose somebody comes to you and says, how is your family's future look like? Your gender. One of the things that you will actually try and look at is, and you should, is what means do you have to bring about the well-being of your family? And your family now, remember, includes your children, grandchildren, potential grandchildren, and so forth, some kind of a forecast of the members of the unit that you want to study. In order to do that, you need some notion of what the basis is on which you can operate. Notice when I talk about a word like a base, I'm already thinking of stocks. I'm not thinking of flows. I'm not asking, it would be wrong of me to say, did I eat well today? Or will I have food tomorrow? You're asking, do I have the means of being able to, in some sense, ensure that tomorrow will be all right, day after will be all right, children's will be all right, and so forth. Now, of course, the ends themselves might accumulate, and you would expect it to accumulate, all right? But you need a kickoff, something with which to trigger the evolution of the ends, of the means, sorry. And that's what I'm calling the productive capacity. We're thinking of the hardware that the economy has to be able to maneuver itself over time and do what it can. That's what I'm saying. I'm calling that productive capacity. We're interested in the ends, but at the end of the day, it makes great sense to study the means to the ends. We shouldn't mistake the means for the ends, but the means are ways to achieve the ends. So now see the move I'm going to make. We are concerned with the ends, namely well-being of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so forth. But in order to be able to judge whether the ends are being met, I'm going to shift the attention to the means and ask the extent to which the means are able to further the ends. That's the move I'm making. The reason I'm making the move is very practical. Data come in the form of means. They don't come in the form of ends. The means being hardware, buildings, roads, etc. Okay. So I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Now, what do I mean by productive capacity? I wanted to distinguish between two types of assets. Remember, the moment I said base, I said our attention turns to stocks of goods and services, of goods. What do I mean by stocks? By a stock, I mean something which has a value which is not dependent of time. That is to say, take GDP. If you ask what the GDP of Japan is, you will not say so many yen. You will say so many yen per year, or per minute, or whatever unit of time is. That's a flow. The stock is so many yen, period. That's it. Now, there are three types of assets that I'm going to distinguish here in my notion of productive capacity. Produced capital, which is the most conventional one. When we talk about productive capacity, that's unfortunately what most people are encouraged to think in terms of by newspapers and so forth, which is roads, buildings, machinery, equipment, and so forth. All this is produced capital. I'm going to call it produced capital. Sometimes people call them manufactured capital. Then a great innovation in economics, of which we economists are very proud. I can be proud because I wasn't contributing to it. I inherited from senior colleagues. We include human capital. That is, I'm going to keep population aside for the moment. We're thinking about knowledge and skills, education, which is embodied in us. We carry it in us. A very abstract notion, but it has very practical implications. A graduate, on average, earns a lot more than somebody who has not finished school. So you feel there is something that person has, which is producing, assuming that the salaries are reflecting something like a desirable output of the person. And in human capital, I will also include health, which very often is not. Education seems to is taken is more of a center of attention in human capital theory, but health too. You may be educated, but if you're very unhealthy, you're unlikely to be able to transform your human capital into something which will enhance well-being for your family or the economy in question. Third type is the one that I like to think I've done something with, which is natural capital. And that is almost invariably missing in economic accounts, and you will see. By natural capital, I'm going to be using now a very generic term, ecosystems and subsoil resources. By ecosystems, I include pretty much everything other than subsoil systems, which Mother Earth has given us directly. Okay? Wetlands, grasslands, mangrove forests, forest in general, all that factory out there with huge engineering components, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, churning out services that we exploit, enjoy, and so forth. Okay? I'm going to call these three my capital goods. And I do that very consciously because there are many other assets which we regard as capital goods today, these days. We think of anything which is durable, we like to call a capital good. Institutional capital, we say. Social capital. Network capital. Cultural capital. Religious capital. We have been known to use expressions like that. People do that. And there's nothing wrong with it. But I'm keeping that separate from here, from this trio, for a very good reason. Try and measure religious capital. Try and measure institutional capital. The good news is there's no need to measure it. What they do, I'm going to call that the social environment. Institution, property rights that is, firms, governments, households, charities, knowledge, natural laws, algorithms, theorems, cultural narratives, history of your society. These things matter. They're terribly important. Social capital, the law, social norms. You don't behave like this here. Or in Japan, we address ourselves this way, not that way. These are terribly important. And when we come to a new country, one of the first things what you try and do is to see how to interpret words, actions, and so forth. I'm going to call all that the social environment. I've included time here. You can ignore it. It's very important, but for today's lecture, ignore it. Why do I separate B from A? The reason is, it's a nice, I could in principle, mathematically, I could include all these in my capital assets, by the way, and talk about wealth. But it wouldn't help. I've kept them separate because I'd like you to think of the social environment as giving the quality to the capital goods that I'm calling capital goods. That is 1, 2, and 3, naturally. Way to interpret it is the following. Consider two islands. Imagine they're identical in terms of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. In fact, you can't tell them apart. Exactly the same. But now suppose they have very different social environments. One is totally corrupt, and the other is like Japan. Now, you would imagine that their future histories will be very different, and you would be right. It started off with the same capital assets. But the fact is that in a well-ordered society, to use John Rawls's very famous expression, the quality of the capital assets will be different from the quality of those same capital assets in a world which is disordered or corrupt or dysfunctional. Okay? Because that seems intuitively absolutely obvious. So the question is, when I think about the productive capacity, I'm including now these two broad types of assets, the social environment on the one hand, and what I'm calling capital goods on the other. How does the productive asset get created? I mean, how do you aggregate them? Well, the social environment can be thought of intuitively as giving quality to this crowd, 1, 2, and 3, and that quality is going to be reflected in the social value of the capital goods. This is something which Professor Uzawa, whom I mentioned in my acceptance speech, and I used to discuss considerably, quite a lot. We pursued these matters, perhaps not in the same way, but we were in agreement as to how to think about it. So when I say social environment bestows quality on capital goods, the way to tease out that quality is through the social worth of these capital goods at the margin. We call them that accounting prices or shadow prices. Why shadow and why accounting? Because they need not be market prices. And the job of us as citizens, and we do, by the way, always, as citizens, we do follow that. The job is to try and estimate those shadow prices. Roughly speaking, how roughly depends on how difficult the problem is, and not rely on market prices. Because in natural capital, many forms of natural capital do not actually have markets. So there is no price to be teased out from the data. You'll have to create those prices through your understanding of the importance of that piece of natural capital to the future of the economy. That requires interdisciplinary work involving ecologists, environmental scientists, economists, sociologists, anthropologists. Beg, borrow, and steal. That's what some of us economists have done all our lives. Try and find little pieces of data here, there, ideas, and put them together and see how to work with them. Okay. Now, I want a measure of the means, remember? The means towards intergenerational well-being. And I'm going to argue that the means is an index called wealth. It's the social worth of an economy's capital goods. In contrast to GDP, which is a flow, wealth is a stock. The social value of a capital good is called its accounting price or shadow price. And accounting prices are the link between the means, which is the productive capacity, loosely speaking, all that hardware that the economy has, to the ends, which is well-being across the generations. Market prices are often the first port of call for estimating shadow prices, but for environmental resources, they usually don't exist. Methods have been developed by economists for estimating accounting prices. Then, before you think I'm a crude, vulgar economist, I give you caution. Don't even try to estimate accounting prices for everything. That would be a mistake. Some goods cannot be valued. Sacred groves, for example, cultural treasures. Don't even waste time saying this is worth this much relative to a building and so forth. Keep them aside. We have ways of thinking about them. We say the shrine cannot be touched, period. You don't say, oh, it's so valuable. No, this is a shrine. We protect it. Okay, so we impute a price when we feel we can. When we can't, keep them aside as stocks. Now, here are the propositions. Wealth per capita, adjusted for the distribution of wealth, is the coin that should be used both for sustainability analysis and for policy analysis. Formally, it means if over a period of time wealth per capita, adjusted for the distribution of wealth, increases, then so does well-being across the generations. Contrarily, if wealth per capita declines, so does well-being across the generation declines. Therefore, Proposition 2A offers us the criterion governments should use to judge whether the economic policies they are pursuing, for example, in pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals, is sustainable. You want to check that the forecast, along that forecast, your wealth per capita is actually increasing. Proposition 2B, the other side of our evaluation exercise, which is policy analysis. If a change in economic policy leads to an increase in wealth per capita, it leads also to an increase in the well-being across the generations. Contrarily, if wealth per capita declines, so does well-being across the generation decline. So it turns out that this one concept of wealth does two tricks for us, serves us two different purposes. suggesting, of course, that means to the theorist that sustainability analysis and policy analysis are very similar. It's just the nature of the change that you're studying that differs. We economists, at least people like myself, love simplicity. So when I realized that one index does two tricks, I can tell you this was one of the happiest days I've ever had. It was a great surprise to me. I wasn't expecting it, but the mathematics came out that way, and it's nice. Okay, now, there have been a few attempts to assess past movements of wealth per capita. The authors of the Inclusive Wealth Report 2014, and I mentioned that its seat of operation is moving to Japan, and the head is, I like to think he's a student of mine. He wasn't, but I like to think that. You know, at my age, whenever I see a bright person, I think he must have been a student of mine, that is. And the director of the Inclusive Wealth Report of 2014 was until very recently executive director of the International Human Dimensions Program of the United Nations University and UNEP, sitting over there, Ananta Rayappa. And so both the previous and the next directors are here. Now, the 2014 report, which Cambridge University Press published, measured movements in the wealth of 140 nations over a period 1990 to 2010. So it was doing sustainability analysis. It was tracking the past and asking whether, crudely speaking, the question was, at 2010, were these countries better off than they were in 1990 when judged in terms of wealth per capita? Okay? But, as you can imagine, I won't bother you about how manufactured capital and human capital were measured. The reason is that they were following standard techniques that are there now in the economics literature. But over natural capital, they didn't have much of a template because that's been neglected in national accounts. And so, but they were the data, they were limited to agricultural land, forests, but as stocks of timber, not as ecosystem services because there are no data. Subsoil resources and fisheries. That was a big improvement because fishery data are amazingly sparse stocks. Try and ask if a nation knows how much fish it has control over. Estimates of wealth changes during 1990 to 2010 were therefore biased upward. They were upward, why? Because we have good reason to think that the ones which are missing had declined in quality or quantity, as the case might be. The authors reported that wealth grew at a positive rate in 92% of the countries in the sample, but that the proportion of countries where growth in wealth per head was positive was only 60%. In other words, population growth is very significant. It was hurting, quote unquote, if you look at the data at face value. And so, because my good friend Jeff is here, I put in the remark that for the UN General Assembly to have ignored population growth in framing the SDGs should therefore be a point of public concern. We should be concerned as citizens with population. Moreover, a reliance on growth in world income to finance the SDGs would be a mistake, because the IWR 2014 reported that GDP per capita grew in 90% of the countries in the sample. So that suggests that GDP and wealth were pointing in opposite directions. Now, when I say it's a mistake to depend on the GDP, I don't mean that income is not important. It's that if you only look at income, you will miss out whether, by growing the income, you're essentially whittling down the productive base, where wealth is declining. But if you don't measure the wealth, then you won't know that your base is actually depreciating. And so at some stage in the future, your income will decline. So GDP and wealth, these publications have shown very conclusively, can point in different directions. And at the end of the day, it's the productive capacity which matters, because the flow depends on the stock, entirely on the stock. So as nations begin to meet the SDGs, their statistical offices should begin to prepare wealth accounts and track movements in wealth through time. Just as firms create annual balance sheets, governments should prepare annual wealth accounts. In this lecture, what I've tried to do is to show you how we should shift our gaze from income and expenditure to assets that a country has, which includes, of course, the social environment. And we should do that if we are interested in what happens in the future, because the entire future is somehow written in the assets that we have now. It almost sounds metaphysical, like somebody saying, well, you know, I can read your palm, and from your palm I can tell you what happens in the future. Now, of course, we think that's rubbish, but this is not rubbish. The assets we have inherited from the past, including our culture and so forth, are the ones on the base on which we can build. But building requires specification. And the building on which we want to put our attention on is wealth in an inclusive sense. And that is the reason why the inclusive wealth reports are called inclusive wealth reports. Inclusive, why? Because it's not looking at one bit of a country's wealth, but the totality of its wealth, and then seeing how they balance. Some bits and pieces, of course, will shrink. Some assets will not disappear. Well, some of them have already disappeared, biodiversity losses and so forth. But the typical argument is that we are making up for it by accumulating other assets. That's a standard argument. Problem is, that's where the sciences come in. They will tell you how much more you can substitute one thing for another. That will affect the accounting prices. If substitution possibilities are low, then the accounting prices or shadow prices of the remaining bits of natural capital will be high, other things being equal. So any further loss will be signaled by a drop in wealth. You can see intuitively how this index actually works. If it doesn't shape up with intuition, there's something wrong, because our intuitions usually are reliable. The trick is to determine when our intuitions go badly wrong. And I think the intuitions that have been built up over the past 60 years of development experience have been really very, very mischievous. We've used indicators which were meant to do something else and planted them into giving us guidance about long-term growth possibilities. And then we haven't asked growth in what? For economic growth, we should ask growth in wealth, not growth in income. Thank you very much.